Hi guys, I'm going to give you a bit of background and then talk about the gorillas. When I was sitting in your shoes, I really didn't know what I wanted to be, and I was dating this girl whose mother worked at a veterinary clinic, and so I became interested in becoming a veterinarian. And I rode with some dairy practitioners, and I decided I wanted to be a dairy practitioner myself, and that's why I went to vet school. But as I was going through vet school, I worked at a small town, my hometown small zoo, the Riverview Park and Zoo, as a keeper, and I realized then that those were the kinds of animals I really wanted to work with. And so I graduated, did practice dairy practice for a couple of years, and then got an opportunity to go with about 250 exotic animals, including elephants, lions, tigers, giraffe, whatnot, from San Francisco in a boat to Japan to set up a safari park. And then there to my residency at the Toronto Zoo, and then again I hit another wall. There wasn't any jobs in Canada. Well, there was only 6 zoo veterinarians in all of Canada, and none of them were leaving because the jobs were so rare. And a job came open down here, and so I came to Baltimore, and it's been a great experience. Two things occurred that made it such a great experience. One is in 1982 they built the nicest zoo hospital in the whole world. Now it's been surpassed since, but it's still a magnificent building. And the second thing was that they had a strong association with Hopkins, and so I had an appointment there. And then we did do a fair amount of research there. Research sort of often holds an ugly connotation for people, but this was research for problems that species were facing in the wild, for which we could work with our captive animals to make new diagnostic tests and develop new treatments. And so now I'll start on the gorillas. But the gorillas are all species, all biodiversity is tied in to carrying capacities. And right now, man is the dominant species as far as carrying capacity goes. And I thought I'd look up, like 2 nights ago, I thought I'd look up, because I always say, well, the human population surpassed 6.5 billion people. And that always seemed like a fantastic number. So I looked this up yesterday, actually, and here we passed 7.5 billion people. And if we just sort of look at this, you can see just even today how many people have been born, and you can see this is relative to births, deaths, and actual growth. So it's pretty phenomenal. And they say that there's been more people born since 1950 than ever before on the face of the earth. And if we just look at this, sort of brings it home, because you can see in the mid 1900s we're about here, and you see we're going exponentially. And yes, we can live on the face of the earth at that rate, but what's it going to do for the rest of the planet? And this is called the blue marble. Now you guys have seen all kinds of pictures in space and stuff, but this was one of the very first pictures ever sent back. And it did 2 things for the population. It made people marvel that we had the technology to get to outer space, but it also made us look at the world as a finite resource. And so if we're looking at people growing exponentially at this point, they're in direct conflict or competition for the resources that wildlife need. And you go, well, why is that so important? But biodiversity is the strength of the earth to resist insults. And so the strength of the earth to withstand either natural insults or the insults that man's putting on it are directly proportional to the biodiversity. And so it is a huge issue. And I'm going to be talking about the gorillas, and I'm only going to be talking about them from the health aspect, from the veterinary standpoint. There are other people doing other activities with the gorillas. However, the gorillas are much the same as all species. Many of the drivers that are causing that population to be in trouble are the same for all wildlife species. And if you look at the globe here, again, you can see that it's a finite resource, and so humans are pushing animals further and further into confined areas. And that does a couple things. And it's also, with the changing weather patterns, we're changing the distribution of vectors of diseases like mosquitoes and ticks and things. So there's a lot going on right now around the world. So I'm going to be talking about gorilla doctors, and it started off as the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, but then we went further than just the mountain gorillas. We started doing all eastern gorillas, which are the eastern lowland gorillas and the mountain gorillas. And we started it with a project called Emerging Pandemic Threats, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. And so when we united with UC Davis, we decided to change our name to Gorilla Doctors. Besides, it was tough raising money when you'd be out at a party and somebody say, well, what's your organization? You say the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project. They go, what? If you just say Gorilla Doctors, they sort of get it. And this sort of slogan is the way we operate, that we're working to save a population or a species, but we're doing it one gorilla at a time. And if we look at this particular population, the mountain gorillas, there's two habitats, one species, subspecies. It is actually working. We started our work right in 1986, and you can see that it's growing. It is the only species of great ape that's growing in the world. The rest of them are in decline. Oops, sorry. And so there's a paper out called Extreme Conservation by Martha Robbins. And you can actually see, let me step back. Habituated animals are ones that are used to human presence so that we can get quite close to them. Unhabituated ones are truly wild gorillas, and I've only seen 3 wild gorillas in the 19 years. Only treated 1 wild gorilla. It had 2 broken legs and obviously perished. So most of them are now habituated, and they're growing at over 4% a year, which is an amazing rate, actually. It's actually even faster than the human population. And when she made the assumptions for computer modeling, which were that every animal that we treat would have died if we didn't treat it, which is probably a little bit too easy, but she wouldn't account if we saved an animal and it had offspring. And so I think that the assumptions are reasonable. And so the veterinary care was responsible for half of the growth of this species. So probably everybody in this room, I know there's one guy that said he saw the mountain gorillas, but probably everybody in this room has seen a live gorilla. And the ones that you saw were the western lowland gorillas. They're pretty much the only species in captivity. And if you divide Africa right down the middle, you have 2 species, the western gorillas and the eastern gorillas. In the western lowlands, there's probably 110,000 of them left, but they're in dire straits because they're decreasing at a very rapid rate, partly because they're in protected and unprotected areas, and people eat them. So they're being used as a food item. The other thing that's occurring is that everybody in the beginning thought that Ebola was coming from great apes. And perhaps it actually is, because people will see a sick gorilla and eat it. However, gorillas and chimpanzees, the other great apes, are just as susceptible to Ebola as people are. So there's another reservoir, which we feel is bats at this point. But when Ebola gets into a human population, CDC goes in and just sort of closes down that village and stops people from traveling. And the virus needs a new host very quickly. It's a very virulent virus. And so it burns through that one population and then stops. But if you think about great apes are very gregarious, and they are always intermingling with each other. And so Ebola doesn't stop. It kills thousands of them before it hits the physical barrier, where the gorillas don't meet with each other. And then there's a newly discovered species down here, the Cross River gorillas, and there's only about 300 or 400 of them left, and they're the most northern species. They're up in this area. And the ones I'm going to talk about are the eastern gorillas. The mountain gorillas in a minute, in great depth, and the Grauerei gorillas are the eastern lowland gorillas. And it's interesting because working on both of them, most of these are habituated, and most of these are unhabituated. These live in a very vast habitat, and these are on very confined parks. And so we have a model, which I'm going to be describing to you today, that's fairly successful for the mountain gorillas, but within 2 hours you could be to the eastern lowlands, and we can't use that model. It just doesn't function. I'll say why. So if we look at gorillas all across Africa, what's causing them to reduce in numbers and possibly to extinction? And the first is deforestation. And deforestation shrinks their habitat and fragments their habitat. And what that means is that you get islands of forest, and gorillas won't cross over open areas. And so you get islands of genetic gorillas where they used to be contiguous, and that's not very good for the population. And the last thing that deforestation does is it sets up roads and gives access to bushmeat hunters. And bushmeat is people feeding their families using wild animals. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that if it's like the Batwa or the pygmies that live in the forest and they eat what they need and that is all. Then they're actually probably the most sustainable population in the world. Even though people are very prejudiced against them and say they're backwards, they actually have the lightest footprint of any population. However, you can see this monkey here, she's chopping up the monkey meat. Once you have roads, then the bushmeat hunters can take it to the restaurants in the cities, and then it becomes unsustainable. And the third greatest threat to the great apes is disease. And if you look at the mountain gorilla, because it's in a protected area, there's no deforestation and there's no bushmeat hunting. And so the disease becomes the primary issue, and that's why I'm here talking to you today. So why should we bother saving the mountain gorilla? I think that it's, if you ever get to see it, there's somebody home there. I mean, it's not like you looking at an animal. It's a two-way street, and they're a sentinel being, and they have thoughts, and they, I don't think we should call them rights, but it certainly is that they have all the emotions that we have. And then if you look at it and you go, if we can't save something that is as close to us as this animal is, then it doesn't bode well for all the other animals underneath in the animal kingdom. And then if I have to back up to talk about biodiversity again, if the mountain gorilla disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't change any of your lives. It would change my life a little bit, but not tremendously. I just come back here and live my regular life. However, it lives in a beautiful park on these mountaintops. And if it goes, this forest goes. And if this forest goes, then there's a lot of biodiversity in this rainforest that would go. And if you, I use a sort of a veterinary story. If you have two kidneys, you can lose one total kidney and not even blink an eye. You can lose probably 40% of that next kidney, and you'd still be okay. But once you go by that 40% on that one last kidney, you get sick, and you get sick quickly. And it's exponential. And I think it's the same sort of way with the globe, that we are losing biodiversity fairly rapidly, and it doesn't seem to be really causing all that much effect, although the weather that we're seeing these days sort of points towards it might be trouble. But I think that we're on a critical basis now, and if we go much below that, it will start accentuating. And then from a very practical standpoint, this area is surrounded by the densest population of humans in all of Africa. And you got to know that that's a lot of people. And so they need food. And right below this park is some of the most fertile ground in all of Africa. And so the rainforest, when it's there, soaks up this water during the rainy season and releases it more slowly. If the forest was cut down, then there'd be a lot more erosion, and the dry seasons would be a lot more severe on the farmers. And then there's ecotourism. Last year, there was over 30,000 people went to see the mountain gorillas in Rwanda alone. And they were paying $750 a day to see them. Now it's $1,500 a day. And if you add up all the drivers, the restaurants, the hotels, it's like a $300 million business for Rwanda alone. And that is the highest foreign income that they have other than aid. And so it's a very large business. In fact, it's a little bit disappointing in a way, because tourism was set up to make gorilla conservation sustainable. But in actual fact, it's now trying to make a country sustainable. And it's really, really hard on the gorillas. And the mountain gorillas were only discovered in 1902, which isn't all that long ago, actually, by a German guy. And he was military guy, and he was on one of these two ridges here, and he saw a large black ape, and he thought, well, it's too big to be a chimpanzee, and it's too far east to be a gorilla. So he did what explorers do, and he shot them, and he sent them back to Germany. And they measured the bones and looked at them, and then they called them a subspecies. So that meant all the natural history museums in the world went and gathered animals for their collection, and they killed 54 more of them, which is pretty significant. This guy's name's Carl Ackley, an amazing guy. He was at the Natural History Museum in New York, and he was responsible for bringing 5 back to New York. But he realized, I mean, he was a biologist, a scientist. He was just a true Renaissance man, and he sort of realized that this population was significant and that it was really fragile. So he went to Belgium and met with King Albert, and between the two of them, they set up the Albert National Park, which is now the Virunga National Park. It's the first national park in all of Africa in 1925, which helped to save the gorillas. And then there was a guy named George Schaller came along, and he works for the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York, at the Bronx Zoo, basically. And he did an amazing job at studying them before Fosse. And his book, The Year of the Gorilla, is probably the best book still. And then Fosse came along. I don't know how many of you have heard about Fosse, but she spent 20 years of her life in the forest with no help studying the gorillas. But what she learned was, she was there because of Louis Leakey, and she was there to study anthropology. She was there to study the behaviors and relate their behaviors to humans. But she soon realized that their numbers were being depleted so quickly that there wouldn't be anything to study unless she changed her direction and started protecting them. And so there's 2 things that she did for the reason I'm standing here. One is she reached out to a veterinarian saying that they're dying of needless infections from snares and other wounds created by humans. And again, she habituated them. And this habituation process takes about a year, and you go up, and the gorillas are really frightened. So if they're frightened, they'll either run away or they'll attack. And then as you spend more time every day with those gorillas, they become more and more used to you. And now you can get, as I say, within 7 meters of them. And so she contacted this fellow, Jim Foster, who was the veterinarian at the Seattle Zoo. But they didn't have any funding. And so she contacted this person, who's Ruth Kiesling. And Ruth Kiesling's father is Mark Morris. He's a very, very famous small animal veterinarian that started, if you guys have pets, science diets, like kidney diet and some of those others. And he made a fortune off of that. And so they decided they would go over and see whether it would be feasible to put a veterinarian on the side of the mountain. But 5 days before they left, Fosse was murdered. And I'm sure you've probably all heard about that. But Ruth, the board didn't go, but Ruth went, and she collected all her notes and brought them back to Denver, kept the Digit Foundation going, which was Fosse's original foundation, and started the veterinary program. So now we're in 3 countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have 7 facilities. There's now 15 veterinarians. 12 of them are African, and we're doing 2 subspecies. And I won't spend much time on here, but our work basically is to restore the population to some of the previous numbers, to lead the scientific community so that we have science to base decisions on, and to promote One Health. And we do the population work by monitoring and evaluating their health, by providing actually individual medical care, which I'll be talking about, doing pathology, and working with orphans. And so every day, every habituated animal is seen, and they check off there's 8 activities or 8 parameters that they check off to make sure that the gorillas are healthy. And our veterinarians, it's done by trackers and guides, but it's also done by veterinarians because they have a better eye for it. And this is a pretty good example. This one came back as being his hair coat was pretty matted and whatnot. And the tracker reported this animal as being sick, where in actual fact, if you kind of look at this animal, he looks pretty healthy. And if you know gorillas, then you know that the mothers keep their babies immaculate. And so it wasn't this one that was sick, it was the mother that was sick, and she was too sick to look after this guy. So then if we get a notice saying that there's a sick gorilla up there, which means that there's a human-induced or life-threatening situation, then we go up and we actually anesthetize the animals or do an intervention. And this is Pablo's group, way back when it was 65 gorillas in this group, 3 silverbacks. And so people say, how do you do it? Well, this is a pipe here, and I'll show you a video at the end if we have time. And we use plastic darts. And so these 2 guys, the gorillas are used to these 2 guys, so they sort of block you. You try and get the patient off to the side if you can, so that the silverback isn't watching, or in actual fact, any gorilla isn't watching, because as soon as they see that dart gun come out, they scream, and then they all disperse, and so you're back to ground zero. And then one of 2 things happens. We dart, and sometimes the animals just sort of think it's a bumblebee bite or something like that, and they don't really do much. And 4 minutes later, they fall asleep, and we go work on them. But a lot of them scream because they're startled. And when they scream, then the silverbacks start charging. And the trackers and guides have to form a circle around us. And they have bamboo sticks. And they don't hit the gorillas with the bamboo sticks, but it's all about show. And so if they're making a lot of noise and hitting the leaves, usually the silverbacks will go back. And we have about 40 minutes to do our work. This is one of the more difficult situations that we have, and that is a baby, trying to work on a baby, because you have to anesthetize the mother and the baby. Now, if it's young like this one's only 3 days old, it will cling to the mother regardless. It won't run away. So you anesthetize the mother, and then you have easy access to the baby. But if they're a little bit older, then the babies will move. And so you have to dart them at exactly the same time, and then hope you have to monitor them, have them recover at the same time. One of the largest needs we have for interventions is snares, and that's a wire snare. And this wire snare has a loop that obviously the gorilla is caught in, and then it has a wire that would be hooked to a tree. Now this one, usually the trackers can get close enough to cut the wire or the rope at the tree so the animal can walk away, but then this will actually cause them to lose their hand. And the snares are not set for gorillas. Nobody is eating mountain gorillas. However, people are hungry. In fact, in some areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a whole village will save up most of the year so that they can have meat at Christmas. I mean, it's a real delicacy. So they set these snares for other antelope in the forest, and the gorillas get caught in them. We do everything in the field, so we have to take all our equipment with us. This was the wild gorilla, and it ended up having 2 broken legs. We tried by putting casts on, but it was unsuccessful. So this animal had to be down for a long time, so we had to carry an oxygen tank and gas anesthesia. And then this is a battery-operated digital Bluetooth X-ray machine, which was one of the first around, so that we can actually take X-rays in the forest. And we have a portable ultrasound machine, so we can do most of our work there. This is an interesting case. This is Mukunda. He's a very large silverback, but when we first met him, he was a blackback. And you may have seen in Newsweek and National Geographic, back in 2007, there were 2 park area managers that were feuding, and they both wanted to get rid of each other. And one knew the other one was corrupt and was going to turn him in. And so the one that was corrupt had 7 gorillas shot to pin it on the other fella. And it was really unusual. I mean, when we first saw it, we thought that it was probably poachers, but they didn't take the gorillas to eat them, and they left the live babies on top. And those are the only 2 things of the dead mothers. And those are the only 2 valuable items from a gorilla. And so Mukunda was a blackback, which means he was under 13 years of age. He took one of the babies, and obviously he couldn't look after the baby because it was only about a month old. So we had to go anesthetize him and take the baby back so that we could bottle raise the baby. Well, Mukunda grew into a very large silverback, and he's what they call a lone silverback. He doesn't have a group. So he decided one day not only to come outside of the park, which they often do to crop raid on the farmers' crops, he decided he was going to walk into town and sit in the market and eat where all the fruits and vegetables and things were. Obviously, this created a tremendous commotion. And so they called us, and we went in, and there was literally hundreds of people yelling and screaming all around. We darted him, and this is carrying him back to the forest. Well, lo and behold, he did it again a month later, and we went in, did the same thing. And we weren't sure what we were going to do, because we knew if he did it too many times, the community would either kill him or he was going to hurt somebody. So something drastic had to be done. But before we could make that decision, he came out a third time. And so there's a fellow named Eddie, who's our veterinarian in Congo. We drove up in the truck, and Mukunda was just off the road. And Eddie pulled out the dart gun, and Mukunda looked at that dart gun, turned around and walked 4 miles straight back in the forest, and has never left since. So they have the ability to reason. This is Emoja. Emoja's mother was missing a foot and an eye from fighting. And so she wasn't a particularly good mother, so Emoja hung out with the silverback. And the silverbacks fight for females and territory a lot. And so Emoja was with the silverback, got in the middle of a fight, and he got this bad laceration on his one wrist, a broken leg on his opposite leg, and he had this. And we couldn't really figure out what that was, but we all assumed that it was intestines hanging out from a bite wound. And lo and behold, we couldn't get to Emoja for 48 hours. But when we did, we were able to anesthetize the mother and her, clean up the intestines, put them back in, and that's Emoja there. And everybody was calling Emoja a male. Well, it turns out that Emoja was a female, and she just had her own baby a couple months ago. So we're really, really pretty proud of that. And here's a fellow that got a snare around his neck, and he's not too bright. This guy had 3 snares, but he's in a group of 8 gorillas, and 5 of them are silverbacks. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to get a hold of little Fred there. And so this particular time, the reason it's as severe as it is it took us 10 days and 6 attempts to be able to get him anesthetized. So that's what I'm saying, saving a species one gorilla at a time. We actually do just treat individual wildlife, which is an unusual thing. In fact, Jim Foster was considered the first veterinarian to treat individual wildlife in their own habitat. Animals do die, obviously, hopefully not after veterinary care. And so we do postmortems. We do complete postmortems in the field to find out why they're dying. And because they're habituated, trackers find them fairly quickly. And if we look at it, these are the why they're dying. Trauma, which is silverbacks fighting, and it's infanticide. So this happens in a lot of wild species. If one male takes over from another male, they kill all the babies, either in the pride of the lions or in the group of gorillas. And that's so the females start cycling right away and they get their genes into the gene pool. And this also includes the snares and other human trauma. So we deal a fair amount with that. And then, but this is the big one right here, respiratory issues, 22% of mortality. And you go, why is that? Well, we know from some gorillas that died in 2009 that they were carrying human metapneumovirus, so that we know gorillas and humans are so genetically similar that they have pretty much the same disease profile. They're susceptible to the same diseases. So it's the amount of zoonosis or transmission of diseases back and forth is the highest in the primates and higher in the great apes. And so we spend an awful lot of time and effort trying to treat and figure out exactly which viruses they are being affected by and what we can do about it. And the interesting thing to me is that you have probably all heard about antibiotic resistance. It's big in the news today. And it's basically if we keep using drugs indiscriminately against bacteria, the bacteria mutate so that the drugs no longer work in them. And that's becoming a huge issue in the world. However, you have the viruses coming from people, but it's the gorillas' own bacterial flora in their respiratory system that's causing the bronchopneumonias and the death. And those are very susceptible to antibiotics still. So it's almost like back in the days you hear about World War II and stuff, when they started using penicillin, they were able to save a lot of people. Well, we see miraculous recoveries in the gorillas. And when you do a postmortem, you do what we call a gross postmortem. And so you look at all the organs in the animal, and then you take a set of those organs, you fix them, and then you make microscope slides so that you can look at, this is a brain here, you can look at the cellular level. And we used to have to bring those to America, but now we read them across the internet. And then orphans. Orphans are animals that have lost their mothers, and we started seeing a lot of orphans in 2004, and we would nurse them back to health, and then we'd ask the government what they want us to do, and the government would say, well, we have nowhere to put them, you look after them. So we had to build a temporary sanctuary, and the gorillas weren't really doing all that well. They weren't thriving, and we realized that they needed more individual care than we were giving them from 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. And so we hired men to sleep with them in the same bed, play with them, and feed them, and then they started thriving. And we did that till they were 3 years of age. And now there's some very, very nice sanctuaries. We look after the health care, but they're all in DRC. Okay, the other thing I'd like to say is that again, just like the world, the globe is not is a sum of all the organisms on it, and that's how as we're surpassing our carrying capacity and having some ill effects on the globe. You cannot look at the health of the gorillas without looking at the health of the people that surround the parks and the tourists, or their cattle, or the environment. And so if we look, this is the way everybody used to look at health before, that there was some overlap, but in actual fact, this paradigm is more accurate. There's a tremendous amount of overlap. So your health relies on your home environment, the people that you live with, the pets that you have. It's all interconnected. And so here we have the perfect storm, and it's actually why I really wanted to take this job. And you have this iconic species that's fairly slow reproducing in this very discrete park with very hard borders that has other wildlife in it that we have to worry about the health of, surrounded, as I said, by the highest density of people in all of Africa. And they're making an average of $1 a day, those people. So that means that their health care, their education, and their hygiene are not top-notch for sure. And there are outbreaks of respiratory problems that go through these people. And then they have their cattle, and we know that the cattle carry a couple diseases, one called brucellosis, another one called TB, which can affect the people and then affect the gorillas. And so we have to look at this picture as a whole rather than just one species. And then, so if we look at the environment, you say, the environment, here's the wall, there's the gorillas' habitat. That's all there is to it, as long as people stay out of the habitat, it'll be pretty much the same. But if you think about it from a health standpoint, the environment for us is any organism that can interact and affect the gorillas, which means that there are organisms, when they come out of the park, there's organisms that they become exposed to out in the community, so we have to start worrying about the communities, like I've said before. And you have tourists coming from all over the world. And they can leave their house and basically be on the side of the mountain in about 48 hours. And so, and travel is a very stressful time where people often will come down with illness. And so when you think about it, we really have to be worried about outbreaks of disease around the world. So if we find that there's a measles outbreak in certain countries, then we will be very careful about the people coming from those countries to the gorillas, because the gorillas are highly susceptible to measles and will die from them, but they're naive to them. They've never been exposed. And then we have to worry about other wildlife like the golden monkey. And the golden monkey has the same, again, susceptibility as the gorillas, so they can actually act as a sentinel. They can, if something happens in the golden monkeys, it sort of forewarns us about what could be happening in the gorillas. And I'll briefly go through this. People are a huge threat. People's diseases are a huge threat to the gorillas. And we divide the human population into four. You have the military, who are in the park, because the park is divided into 3 countries, and those countries aren't the best of friends all the time. So there is military activity in the forest, and we can't do much about that, and we wouldn't want to, but we do try to teach them about hygiene and conservation so that they'll minimize their impact. Then you have this dense population that I was telling you about, and there are 13 clinics surrounding the parks, and each one of those clinics sees about 30,000 people, and there isn't one doctor in any of the clinics. It's all run by nurses. And then they get triaged down into the main hospital if they're still sick. So the healthcare system is as good as President Kagame has made it, and it's really good for the region. It still has limitations. And then you have the tourists. I've already talked to you about the tourists. But you have the trackers and guides. And the trackers and guides actually spend a lot of time with the tourists. They spend about 6-7 hours in close contact. I mean, they're pulling them up, they're sort of touching them, grabbing them, pushing them, helping them up the side of the mountain. Plus, they're a snapshot of what's going on in the community. And this is a finite number of people, so if we can actually have some events happening in here, then health events, then we might be able to minimize the risk to the gorillas. And that's what we do. We have an employee health program. And basically, every tracker, guide, and porter goes to a doctor once a year, and then when they're ill. And then we have to worry about people's animals that are surrounding the parks. There still is rabies in the park. People still die of rabies in Africa. And basically, it's a problem with feral dogs traveling between the park and the community. And the reservoir, the animal that keeps the rabies circulating in the park, is called a jackal. So we now have a rabies program going to try and eliminate that. And you go, well, how does a dairy cow affect the forest? Well, right now, the dairy cows are poorly managed, and we are setting up, with UC Davis, setting up a dairy co-op, which will bring the cows in. We'll get rid of the 2 diseases that they have. We'll feed them. We'll make sure that they have the right amount of water, proper amount of water for milking, and we'll teach them better dairy hygiene, how to collect the milk, and we'll have better collecting areas. And we feel that we can double the amount of milk within a matter of months with the same cows. And what does that mean? It means 2 things to us. One, it's more money for the people surrounding the park so they don't put as much pressure on the park. And secondly, it's going to take the cows and the people, we're moving them away from the park and putting them in a community dairy and making a buffer zone so that the effect, the amount of exposure between the wild animals and the people will go down. And just briefly, we spend an awful lot of time collecting and preserving samples. Now, that might seem like a very boring thing to do. But when we knock an animal down, we take the samples so that we can make the diagnosis, and then we store it so we can do future research. And we've done the complete genome of the mountain gorilla now. The second thing is that preserving these samples for the future is extremely important, and we have tens of thousands of samples now saved for other researchers, and that's just the biobank there. I'm going to briefly, I know some of you have to leave, I'm going to briefly, yep, you're welcome, talk about the emerging pandemic threats. So right now, with the human population set the way it is, as high as it is, and growing, and globalization is the rapid transport of people from one place to the other, we're basically set to have a pandemic. And pandemics can kill millions and millions of people if not caught early. And in fact, it did with the 1918 flu outbreak. And so we're set for that. So the United States government is saying, yikes, we better build capacity in foreign countries so that they can recognize an emerging virus before somebody gets on a plane and comes to the United States. And so there's the EPT2 program. And if you look at the emerging pandemic threats like SARS, Ebola, MERS, all those, 75% of them are coming from wildlife, either directly from wildlife into people or from wildlife into domestic animals into people. And so we're coming up our 8th year in 2 weeks. We've been looking at rodents, bats, and primates, the viruses in those, because those viruses in those genera are most likely to jump into humans. And so I'm just going to quickly, the thing that boggles, I think, my mind, this is in 23 countries. We're subcontracted for 3 countries. We found 169 of the known viruses that we expected to see there, the ones that everybody's already talking about being vaccinated for, whatnot. But we found 815 novel viruses. That doubled the number of known mammalian viruses in 5 years. And so there's a lot out there that we need to be worried about. Now, you say, what are we going to do about it? Well, in actual fact, what you can do is just increase the workforce, the One Health workforce, we call them, so people are ready and able to make the diagnosis and respond to these and to help build sustainability in the labs. And I'm going to wind it up here, but basically, the U.S. aid in development is sending money out to set up a One Health platform in the country. Now, their interest is not gorillas or wildlife. Their interest is people. But if you look at the One Health community, it doesn't matter what country, whether it's America or Sudan or wherever, the human health system is always better than the livestock health, is better than the wildlife health. But this is where the diseases will emerge from. And so USAID realizes to help people, they have to work with wildlife. And what that does for us is it develops this, the disease surveillance, the cold chains, the laboratory capacity, and the veterinary capacity, which in the end promotes conservation and environmental health. And the last thing I'd have to say is that our legacy, I mean, we're very, very happy that the gorilla population is on the increase, but our legacy is going to be the number of people that we teach and to make sure that there are talented wildlife veterinarians in the future for these countries so that they don't have to have as much expat influence. And that's it, unless you have a question. Yep. Hi, Anthony. Okay, so good. It's a great question, and it's there's multiple layers there. I think that obviously you can fund or help fund things that you feel a passion for. You can, if you are in a field that is related to conservation, you can certainly help out by doing a research project or something like that. But probably more importantly is the influence that you have locally. And you know, I mean, you got to be as green as you possibly can and thinking about those things. And, you know, there's the obvious like recycling and you know, reducing your consumerism, like not throwing as many things out, utilizing them longer. But I also think, and it's not going to be at your age, but you have to be, and this is a really difficult thing to do, but you have to understand that when you start making investments in companies, you need to know what those companies stand for and what damage they're doing and whether you want to be part of that damage. And so there are a lot of green, sustainable industries out there now, and if we can all sort of move more towards those and away from others. but it is a really difficult question. You know, we all go, oh, Exxon's bad because of Exxon Valdez, and you know, I stopped buying Exxon gas. But it doesn't matter. I mean, we're all consumers, right? We all drive our cars, and until we sort of change our frame of mind or our reference, then we're asking those oil companies to go out, you know, and we can get really angry when they go into parks and start drilling in parks. But it's our demand that's doing that. So I think there's some stuff you can do locally, and then local conservation species that are in trouble around here, peregrine falcons and other species, you can get involved with those through natural resources. And box turtles is another fairly big one. Checkered butterflies, you know, I think it's I can't remember which fern it is, but they have a particular fern that they need for breeding and stuff, and they lay their eggs on, and so you could influence your backyard or your parents' backyard to make it friendlier for a lot of the species that are local. That's a great question, and basically One Health is to break down the communication silos, because the health sectors are all pretty much into what is their mission, right? But I was just 2 hours ago, I was in a meeting because we're trying to make our gorilla health records talk with our employee health records. And so we're doing that. And yes, we'll hear, oh, there's a measles outbreak, and we'll respond to that. Not so much the other way. And two things. I think that when you have a population of 1,000 animals total, and in Rwanda maybe 200, and you have 30,000 people visiting them, you're more concerned going that way than the other way. Now, if there was an outbreak, or we thought there was an outbreak of Ebola or something, oh my God, we'd be all over it, right? I mean, so we are pretty aware of that, yeah. The other thing is that it amazes me that the mountain gorilla population, I guess it's been isolated long enough, is a very pristine population. There's instead of AIDS, there's SIV, so simian immunodeficiency virus. But these guys have never been exposed to it. So, and again, we've done probably 150 postmortems on these guys, and we've never seen anything that would make us go, whoa, you know, we have a big issue. So it's amazing, actually. Yep. With what, sorry? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, a little loud there. Actually, let me show you a video, and that may answer your question for you, if I can get it to work here. Okay, so this is an animal that had an infant on it, and it developed a very large breast, and they wanted us to diagnose what was going on with the breast. So this guy is one of our veterinarians, and this guy's sort of our lead veterinarian. He's drying up the drugs. You can see the weather's really nice. That's what the weather's typically like. And so you have to be prepared beforehand. Okay, let me. This is the CO2 pistol. This is the pipe here that the dart goes in, and you can modify the pressure here. Okay, so this is the one we want, but she's got a baby, and we really don't want to work with the baby.
She's moving, Noel.
You'll also hear one of the other limitations. Okay, that was the darting. Remember I told you they'd scream?
Here he comes.
Okay, so we're worried about this silverback. Just in his prime.
So quickly I missed it, Noelle.
So at this
So
point,
quickly I missed it.
the one we darted is behind
It's all right.
the silverback, and we're having a hard
Not the
time
important part.
figuring out how we're going to get by him.
So I think one of the problems is going to be that when we get close to the female, the baby is going to start screaming.
Yeah. Looking for the dart.
Yeah, it'd be good to find the dart so we know that it fired.
Okay, so this is the rest of the group. You can see that they calm down quite a bit. So these guys are eating, and that's a mother and baby just sitting. That's not the one we darted. Okay, so we're going to try and go around and to the left. This animal weighs over 400 pounds. And he's still between us and the... Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the animal's now totally anesthetized, and we only have 40 minutes. We're still trying to get to it. There is a point to this video with the Toronto thing. So the other thing is that they often look nonchalant, but they know exactly what's going on. So we've moved down around, and he comes down again. And that's the baby on top of the mother, not asleep. Now this is what I wanted you to see. He seems pretty calm. To this day, I don't know what set him off right there. Now you see the guys with the sticks. There's the mother anesthetized, but as soon as we go near the mother, the baby's going to scream. As soon as he screams, the silverback's going to charge us. So it's kind of a tenuous
You're going to need
situation.
people in front of you, Noelle.
So then we're thinking we might want to anesthetize the baby to keep him quiet. And we're also with a group of trackers
The baby's going to scream.
that haven't done this very often. So
Be
they're a little
prepared, the
nervous,
baby's
too.
going to
And you'll
scream.
see the silverback's sitting in the bushes right here. You have to blame the cameraman for
Think we can move him?
There's the can back out. You can hear the chest beat.
I think you're going to have to give it, Noelle. I think you're going to have to give the baby some drug. Unless it goes now. Unless it goes now.
You can see the cameraman backing up. That's me. Backing up.
Yes? Okay, back off. Give the baby a couple minutes.
See how furious he is? So it settles down and we do our work. So to answer your question, I mean, I watched that video of Trombe, and he was getting worked up. If the people had been quiet in the crowd, but the crowd was screaming, he was confused. He had that kid, and everybody says, well, just dart him. Well, you heard the animal scream when it was darted. And I personally think if they tried to dart it, he would have bitten the kid. And so the follow-up to that is that we posted on our website supporting the zoo, because the zoo, Tarambe is in captivity. He's never going to add to the wild gene pool, so his days of being part of a conservation effort, other than an educational program, are done, basically. And so when you invite people into a facility to see animals, you have a responsibility to make sure they're safe. But we put it on the website, and we started getting hate letters. We had to pull it down. So I support what the zoo did, is what I'm saying, long story short. Yep. Once the noise, the alarm calls are over, they usually settle down pretty nicely. We're lucky. People, I've not been bit. I should touch wood, but we have had veterinarians that were bitten. Yes?
My question is about the origin of the hypertension, the respiratory diseases.
Well, I think that they have their own viruses that causes some of it. I think that if there were no humans around, they would still get respiratory illness, but I do think that humans are a large source for the original viruses. And what I mean by the original virus is the virus comes in, causes damage to the mucosa of the respiratory system, and then the bacteria come in after. Great. Well, oh. Great question. In the zoos, they'll live into their 50s. In the wild, a very old gorilla is 45. Actually, it's funny. I was out at a local sanctuary the other day, and I don't know, capuchins, the South American little monkeys, are called organ grinder monkeys. There was one there that was 48 years old. Pretty amazing. Great. Well, thanks, guys.